Welcome to our presentation. I'm Terrell Davis, and I am the Ag and Natural Resources Agent in Pike County. I'm in Murfreesboro. And so our point today is just to go over what is an invasive and a poisonous plant, and how can we identify those plants and possibly some symptoms. I will say that if you're interested in control, you should contact your local county agent, or we have some good resources such as MP 522 that most offices will have readily available. There is a cost for that publication, but it's a very good resource on controlling many of the weeds that we have in our pastures. Today I have chosen not to include all of the control recommendations just because of the sake of time to lower that. So when we start out, we talk about invasive plants and what is an invasive plant. And many times when we talk about invasives, we think about them being non-native plants. But an invasive can also be a native plant. They show signs typically of growing very aggressively and overtaking other plants. And again, if it's a non-native, many times it takes over those native plants. And once they overtake an area, they change the whole ecosystem. And many times they smother out native plants, and those ecosystems rely upon many things. And so once those other plants are taken away, the ecosystem changes. And so regardless of whether we're talking to the smallest insects or we're talking about cattle, the whole ecosystem changes once those invasives have taken over. And typically invasive plants have a mechanism. They release a toxin. Maybe it's just their aggressive growth. Many times they have tap or fibrous root systems, and it just makes them a little more difficult to control. But that is their mode of survival. In the United States, we spend lots and lots of money on stopping the spread of invasives. We spend more than $130 billion annually on eradicating and blocking the entry of non-native invasive species. So we have a lot of money spent on stopping invasives. But if we were to imagine if we didn't take those efforts, the economic impact of invasives taking over agricultural land would be much greater than that $130 billion that we're talking about. So it is a needed thing. And so the problem is invasives are here. We're probably not ever going to eradicate any invasive. And so control is the goal for right now. Some examples of invasives that you probably recognize would be kudzu, sweet gum, and privet. They're very readily available, especially here in Southwest Arkansas. And so we'll talk about maybe how they work to overtake the natural environment. So a toxic plant, it's kind of self-explanatory, but we talk about multiple problems. So it could be a skin irritation, a loss of appetite, loss of weight, reduced milk, and occasionally death. But the important thing to remember with toxins is that toxicity is in the dose. So just because a plant is toxic does not necessarily mean that fatality is the end result. So we've got a couple of things to think about. Number one is that the animals just might not eat them. They're not attractive to them as a forage or a roughage, so they don't even worry about them. And so therefore, it's probably not something we have to worry about. The plants may contain toxic levels of the poison at the time they're eaten. So for example, we will discuss Johnson grass a lot in this presentation because it's something that we are very familiar with here in Southwest Arkansas. But there are times in that plant's life when they are more toxic than in other times. So for example, for Johnson grass, smaller plants have a greater concentration of nitrates, and therefore Johnson grass is actually more toxic as a smaller plant. There are times when, say, frost has come up on that plant and prussic acid is a greater concern for us. So it all depends upon a lot of things. And so not at all times will Johnson grass be toxic to cattle. Animals eating the plants may be immune to the poisons they contain. We will talk about buttercups in a little bit. And cattle can eat small doses of buttercups and build up an immunity to that plant. So the animals, even though the poison may exist, they may build up an immunity to them. And then lastly, we may render the plants non-toxic. So back to Johnson grass, if we cut those plants for hay and we've allowed them to sit out for about 7 days, then the level of prussic acid has gone way down and it is no longer considered toxic to our cattle. So we may render the plant in such a way that it is not toxic anymore. When we talk about the severity of poisoning, we have to think about several different things. One is the plant species and how does it absorb nitrates or other poisonings. Maybe the part. Could it be just part of the plant that's poisonous, or is it the whole plant itself? Environment. So I mentioned on this with freezing or frost may release deadly levels of prussic acid. So the environment has a lot to do with it. Drought could be a part of that factor. Plant age. Lots of times we think the older a plant is, the more toxic it is, but it could be the opposite of that. It could be the younger the plant. And then fed, the way that it is fed to our animals, is it a plant that they graze upon, or is it something that we've cut and we've conditioned it and then we baled it up and fed it to them later? All of those factors play a role when we talk about the severity of poisoning. Some conditions that lead to poisoning. Grazing animals would typically not eat a poisonous plant unless they're forced to do so. So that could be a lack of forage. A drought could be happening. We could overgraze. In Arkansas, we recommend somewhere around 2 acres for each head of cattle. So maybe you're just overgrazing it and there's nothing else to eat, and that's what they've gone to. A waste or trash, such as going through maybe late fall and clipping all the plants and doing your pruning, and all of that waste that you just had to take it out, which is what we recommend, but you've thrown it over the fence, could be a problem. For example, elephant ears. Before the frost comes, I typically cut mine and put them in a pile. Well, if you were to throw that over the fence, it's still green and there's still something that probably will eat it. So that's something that lots of times we might not think about, but those things that we throw over the fence could be a potential hazard for us. Maybe you've cultivated new grounds, you've exposed roots. We will talk about weeds, that the root is the most toxic portion. So that could be an issue. And then there's times when maybe we just don't have a lot of water and we're going through a drought season. And so those toxins are concentrated more than we typically have. And then sometimes we just have to realize that with livestock, things happen that might not have a good explanation for it, but animals are going to do what animals are going to do. And sometimes it just happens. Sometimes we need to think about poisonous substances that affect it. So, for example, minerals could be a problem. Typically not a problem in Southwest Arkansas, and here, especially in Pike County. We don't have a lot of mineral deficiencies, but too much or not enough minerals sometimes will affect their health. And so here we're talking about too much, and it could be a problem. Mostly that is a problem in central and western United States and the plain states, but can happen in parts of our state. Nitrates, we've mentioned that with especially Johnson grass. So it's just a sudden change in the animal's diet to plants with high nitrate content. And nitrate goes to nitrite, which messes with their blood. So nitrates are something we have to think about. And then resins, they affect their nervous system. So as we go through this presentation, we will talk about different glycosides. And I wanted you to see this screen so that you have something to refer back to. You may have to rewind a little bit and look at this again. And at the end of this presentation, you will find my email address. Feel free to email me and say you want a copy of the PowerPoint, and I will do so. But as we go through, we'll talk about some of these glycosides, and I won't refer back to them as to what they specifically do. To point out alkaloids, and if they affect the heart and nervous system, you will see alkaloids a lot. You will see irritant oils as we go through, and some of these others, but just to know how they affect an animal physiologically. So we'll go ahead and start with our plants and talk about them specifically. So we start with bitter sneezeweed. These are listed in alphabetical order because that's how Terrell works, his organization, and bitter sneezeweed was our first. And so they're not in order of toxicity or anything like that. So with bitter sneezeweed, we see the toxic parts include the leaves, the stems, the flowers, and the fruits. So I think it would be safe to say every part of a bitter sneezeweed would be poisonous to our cattle. So sesquiterpene lactone is the toxin there, and there's a lot of words that I might not say because I'm going to butcher them, but the lactone portion of that toxin actually gives it the bitter taste that it has. And so sometimes we see lactone in other things that we eat, such as spinach or turnips, and a lot of other different greens have lactone, and they give it that bitter taste. So obviously, if an animal is eating a bitter plant, as it processes, and let's just say we've got a cow eating bitter weed, her milk is also going to be bitter, and the calf is going to notice that. So not only does it affect her, it also affects her offspring. And again, for control of a lot of these weeds, we have some recommendations for those. But bitter sneezeweed is a summer annual. It'll come out in the springtime, so May would be a good time to control that. And for a recommendation, again, MP 522 or call your local agent. Black locust is a tree that we have here, especially in southwest Arkansas, that causes some problems. So obviously with black locust, we also have the spines or the thorns on this tree that can cause some problems, and that's not the toxic parts that I have listed, but they can cause a problem. Toxic parts include the inner bark, the seed, the flowers, and the leaves. And we have listed our symptoms of vomiting, trembling, and dilated pupils. And the toxin is actually rhobanin, which is a phytotoxin. And so we see this tree be especially poisonous if you've got an animal such as, say, goats. They're going to kind of nibble on things, and so that inner bark could cause them some problems. And then when those seeds or those leaves fall to the ground, it's probably going to be more of an issue than them eating directly from the tree. Because of the spines, they're not going to want to eat probably directly from the tree. Buttercup is well known in southwest Arkansas. It's in pastures all over the place. Buttercup is a cool season weed, so this is the time here in January. We need to be working on controlling buttercup, easily controlled with a 2,4-D product. So the toxic part could be the stems and the leaves. We also have toxicity in the blooms. I didn't list that, but the pollen that a buttercup produces can cause some respiration problems. Symptoms include death, ulcerated skin, red milk, and bitter milk. So once again, we see where it's not just the animal this animal that's affected. Say a cow eats this, then her milk is also affected, and therefore the calf is affected. It works through an irritant oil. And so buttercup is one of those plants, though, that they can build up an immunity to. But let's just say, for example, your cattle that you've had on your place that are used to your buttercup being there, they build up an immunity. But if you go and buy some replacement heifers and they didn't come from somewhere that had buttercup and you've put them out, then all of a sudden we have a bit of a problem there because they're not used to it. And you may see some of these symptoms more from them than you do those cows that you had. So we can't blame it on the guy we bought them from. It may be something that we caused ourselves. Cocklebur, besides just being a nuisance, and in Southwest Arkansas in about July or August, we start seeing these stuck-in tails and they're all over the place. But they also have some toxic parts. So the seed and very young seedlings tend to be the problem with cocklebur. And so they're going to graze these plants when they're young, and it could cause some problems. Typically, that's just going to be an upset stomach type of thing, which can lead to weight loss, but not a huge problem. These animals can also develop a tolerance to cockleburs, so that's a good thing. But again, if you introduce new animals, they may not have that tolerance established. So we get a lot of calls in our office about ergot. And especially people have worried about that last cutting that they did in, say, September, or they feed the hay that they made from this cutting later on in the year. That becomes an issue. But typically around mid-September, we start to see some problems, especially in Dallas grass. So Dallas grass in itself is not necessarily toxic, but the thing that we have to remember with ergot is that we always find ergot in mature seed heads. So we have some options. If we want to graze our cattle on Dallas grass that has ergot, then it would be recommended that you go through and say a bush hog and go through and cut the seed heads. Then your Dallas grass is edible. But as long as those seed heads happen to be there, it's going to become a problem. And the other thing that we have to think about is putting hungry animals on infected grasses. So if you've had the scenario where your late fall, your Bermuda grass is starting to go into dormancy and they've ate it down, or we've had a drought, what have you, and there's just not grass there, but you have a field, so you have a sacrifice field that you're going to feed hay on, and you just want to go ahead and let them graze that down before you start feeding hay. If they're hungry, the first thing they're going to go for is whatever they see first. And animals are going to wrap their tongue around that seed head and ingest it. And so that's when it becomes a problem. So we either need to put cattle out before seed heads develop. We need to make sure all the seed heads have been cut off. Something so that we don't just put hungry cows on that field and start to see these problems. So the symptoms of ergot are trembling, incoordination, lameness, loss of a tail or hoof, convulsions, delirious, or excitable. And many times with ergot, we do not recover from that. We may save the animal and death may not be the final result, but there will probably still be some problems there. They're not going to regrow the tail or hooves are going to get any better. And that lameness that they found, they may carry some of those symptoms along with them as they go. Ground cherry. I'm just going to be honest with you. I've grown up in Pike County my whole life, and ground cherry has never been a problem. I don't know that I had seen one until this year. But we as ag agents had a demo in Hope at the research center, and what we found is that we were very good at growing ground cherries. They covered the place. They were very prolific there. They just were thick, and so it became a huge problem. And here's the thing with ground cherries. There's actually recipes for making jellies and jams with ground cherries, and a ripe ground cherry is not a problem. but an unripe ground cherry fruit is a problem. And the tops of those leaves, those tender portions that the cattle are going to eat, are also a problem. So they go back to alkaloids, which we said go back to the heart and the central nervous system. And so ground cherry is one of those things that we can control pretty easily. But we're going to find that in late fall, this is one of those plants that it's still going to be green when everything else turns brown, and all of a sudden it becomes interesting. And at the same time, that's when the unripe fruit will be there. So something that we definitely need to look at. The issue that we had as ag agents in our demo was fall forages. We planted fall forages and we bush hogged it, and ground cherry beat everything else and had no competition and grew like crazy. So something to think about. Hemp dogbane is not a plant that we deal with a lot here in Southwest Arkansas, but it can be very dangerous. And so in isolated cases, especially here in our part of the state, we'll see it. In other parts of Arkansas, it does exist. And so you see the toxic part is green or dry leaves. So any way you go about it, the leaves are going to be toxic. So whether that's in hay, they got cut and put in a bale of hay, or if it's green out in the field, it's still toxic. Symptoms include increased temperature, sweating but cold extremities, dilation of the pupils, discoloration of the mouth and nostrils, and refusal to eat or drink. So obviously we also see some weight loss going on there. And so it's a weed that we do need to take care of and control in our pastures. Horse nettle, everyone in at least South Arkansas knows horse nettle. It's fought horse nettle for a long time. And I remember being a little kid and feeding cows. And I didn't know what horse nettle was then, but I knew it because my fingers found it when we rolled out that bale of hay. And if you can imagine that same surprise as a cow with a tongue getting into some horse nettle, you know that that's probably not a good feeling. So besides the things that we've listed, it's also just a nuisance, and physiologically, it can cause some damage to those cattle or goats, what have you, that are eating hay with horse nettle. Cattle typically are not going to graze horse nettle, maybe when it's small, but typically they're not going to graze it. But again, if it's green and nothing else is, it might become an option. So toxic part are berries, whether they're ripe berries or green berries, they're toxic. And the leaves are toxic also. And I did put a control here because one swoop of spray is not going to take care of horse nettle. Anything that's going to carry a berry like this is probably going to have some multiple sprays to go along with it. So the recommendation control for horse nettle is graze on P+3 at 3 pints per acre. To apply this at mid-bloom through fruiting, and apply it for 3 continuous seasons. So just remember that this is not a one swoop and we're done with horse nettle scenario. It's a thicker leaf, so a surfactant might be a good idea too. But it is something that we're going to have to control several times. And so we've got the toxic part, plus just the fact that it's a nuisance and our cattle don't want to graze it. So Jimson weed. And not only is Jimson weed toxic to animals, but if you do a little research, you can find that Jimson weed is also a plant that especially teenagers experiment with a little bit. They can use the seed from a Jimson weed and make a tea out of it and drink it, and it becomes a hallucinogen. And so there's cases that have been documented where teens have tried that, and most of those follow with a police record to go along with it. But it can be a problem for more than just livestock. Just want to make that kind of a scenario that we have to think about. So the seeds are the most toxic part of a Jimson weed plant. The entire plant can be toxic, but especially those seeds. And Jimson weed creates somewhat of a little melon, and the seeds are inside of that, and there's hundreds of seeds inside one fruit. The symptoms include dilated pupils, thirst, and then dry or burning skin. So you can kind of think about that, and dilated pupils is one thing that's kind of hard to diagnose in cattle. But you can notice maybe with that dry and burning skin that they're itching all the time, or maybe they've rubbed some spots on them, that type of thing. And so Jimson weed again for control, contact your agent. Johnson grass. Johnson grass is a plant that we all know too well in Pike County. There's not a sector of this county that I can go to without finding Johnson grass. And, you know, uncontrolled Johnson grass can become also an invasive. It takes over a field pretty quickly. So all parts of a Johnson grass plant are toxic, but particularly the green stunted plants, frost damaged plants, and second growth. And again, the Johnson grass, the smaller the plant, the more we see with toxicity. So some symptoms include slow pulse, dilated pupils, labored breathing. When they breathe out, it has an almond smell to it. And this is one of those where cattle regularly recover from the toxicity with Johnson grass. So there's two things that we worry about with Johnson grass. One is prussic acid, and that's more of an issue after a stress, a drought, a frost, those types of things. Nitrates are more of a problem when it's a small plant or some of those stunted plants from drought. And so we have a fact sheet, FSA 3024, that talks about nitrate poisoning in cattle. Johnson grass is referred to quite a bit in that. And also the remedy for nitrate poisoning that I've listed here at the bottom is also in that fact sheet, 4 milligrams per pound of body weight of methylene blue. And again, the problem with nitrate poisoning is that nitrates turn to nitrites and clump up the blood. So it's something that we definitely have to look at. Nitrate poisoning can happen very, very quickly, as can prussic acid. So therefore, that gives us a big concern for Johnson grass in our pastures because it causes such a problem. It's so prevalent. And there's just a lot of people, I don't think, that truly understand how toxic Johnson grass can be. If processed correctly and completely, Johnson grass can make a good forage. It makes fairly decent hay, but the problem is doing all those things correctly. Our next weed is Mexican tea, and one that we don't really think about a lot, and I think that it's a weed that we see a lot around our area, but we don't know what it's called because it seems to have been fairly new in our area. Good news is that our larger livestock aren't really a concern here. The seeds are the toxic part, and they're fairly small seeds. And so we're really kind of restricted to poultry. So any of you who have backyard flocks, Mexican tea would be an issue and something that you want to look at. And so if you look at some of the symptoms of nausea, muscular weakness, and vertigo, you may just see some birds out there that are stumbling around a little bit and kind of have a drunk look to them. And that would be a cue that maybe they've gotten into some of this. And it's not that cattle can't, it's just that this is one of those weeds they're not really attracted to. Our next one is milkweed. The toxic part is leaves. And I just have to say this with milkweed is that it's both the butterfly milkweed and then just a natural milkweed that we find, or common milkweed. Both of them, the leaves are a problem, but the newer milkweed that a lot of people plant for monarch butterflies is growing in popularity. So just to keep an eye out on that. And as we talk about invasives in a little bit, you'll see that several invasives came with a certain purpose, but they escaped the landscape and then they became a problem. Oaks, we don't think about that a lot, but because of acorn poisoning, we have to talk about oaks. And we also have a fact sheet on acorn poisoning on our uaex.edu website. So some symptoms that we might see are frequent urination, dry muzzle, constipation, thirst, and hair coat. So one of the things that we see with the ruminant system is that, it has several compartments. And so it works by just turning things. And so when we turn these acorns and we compact them, when it gets into the digestive tract, that's when the constipation occurs. And then we've kind of backed up the system and given the time for the system to really absorb the tannins that are in these acorns. So another use for tannins is that in the tanning process, we use them to absorb oxygen and dry out leathers. And so you can imagine that being in a ruminant system where oxygen is being absorbed to this other material and then excreted out the system, that can cause some major problems. And typically, acorn poisoning happens because we don't put out a supplemental feed, a fall forage or hay or what have you. So they start muzzling around on short grass, and that's when they pick up acorns. As I mentioned earlier, one of the problems can be ornamentals, that we clean out the flower bed or what have you, and we just throw them over the fence. And so I put some of the more common. Latania can be poisonous, as can red maple and elephant ears. So think about an alternative to that, a compost pile, or putting them in a pile of things that you're going to burn later on and keep animals away from that, instead of just tossing them over to the fence. So another biggie for us here, and especially South Arkansas, is Perilla mint. So I know most of y'all have seen Perilla mint. It's also referred to as mint weed, rattlesnake weed, because the seed heads, after they dry, have a rattlesnake sound to them. So Perilla mint is pretty well limited to being an undergrowth plant. It's in fence lines, it's in wooded areas, that place where your cattle go after they get a belly full and they go to lay down and ruminate. Perilla mint is there. So one of the problems we see with Perilla mint is that it's one of those plants that's green when nothing else is. And it doesn't become attractive to cattle at all until it's all they have. And then they will eat, especially the tender growth on top. Those flowering parts, of course, are on top, so that's where they get them. And so we see some symptoms here, especially respiratory. And so the ketones in Perilla mint cause acute respiratory distress syndrome. And it can happen pretty quick. You don't realize that the cattle have gotten into there, and then you see the problem and you don't have a cure for that. So the other thing about Perilla mint is that since it doesn't grow out in the main part of the pasture, it loves a shade growing area. And typically, you don't worry about that when you spray for weeds. Your boom doesn't reach out there. Your cluster nozzle doesn't reach out there. So a recommendation we might find for Perilla mint is, if you've got a side-by-side or four-wheeler that has a sprayer, to just go ahead and mix up just for Perilla mint and go around that fence line, and when you see it, spray it. And spray it young. Don't wait till it becomes a problem, but we can go through in June or July and start seeing Perilla mint. So go ahead and spray it, knock it back, so that when it comes fall time, it's not even an option for our cattle to graze on. And again, if we put out hay or a fall forage, we probably don't have to worry about it. So pokeweed is our next one. And in Southwest Arkansas, that sometimes becomes a staple. Many a time I watched my mom make some poke salad. But there was a process to that, right, to make it not poisonous anymore. And cattle don't have that option. So roots are especially the most important, the poisonous part, but leaves and fruits, all parts can be poisonous. And our last poisonous plant we talk about is wild cherry. And we have to especially look at wilted leaves. And you see prussic acid there again. So that makes us think frost, right? We have wilted leaves, so a drought or a frost, and all of a sudden that prussic acid builds up. And if you've got those wild cherry limbs holding down, hanging down, then it's something green that they're going to eat. And you might think of other animals like goats more so than cattle, just because of their browsing. Okay. So we're going to start a little bit on invasives. I don't have a lot of invasives, so hopefully we'll go pretty quick after this. But to think about this, we talked about $130 billion being spent every year to stop invasives. And we have to think about the point that if we didn't spend that and invasives took over, they take over vital agricultural land. They typically smother out whatever is in their way. So they change ecosystems, and there's a lot of damage that can be done with invasives. And the invasives kind of seem not so bad at first. And we'll find that as we go along that they had a purpose, but due to their growing pattern or the toxins they release, they soon become what we didn't want them to be. Typically, they do not have a natural predator, and that's why their growing pattern is taken over so well. So I put bull thistle. We can put any thistle here. Thistles of any type, especially Pike County and southwest Arkansas, we see musk thistles more than we see bull thistles or sow thistles. But any thistle, we know that a lot of these things still apply to them. So they were native in Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa. And it's thought that they were introduced to the United States with contaminated seed imports. So especially in the early days when we imported a lot of seeds into this country, 1800s, these guys, can get into crops. And of course, back in those days, we didn't worry about the purity of any seed. And so they came on board through ships bringing seeds to our country. And we know they're prolific seeders, and they are made to where the wind blows and they go all over the place. They're spread multiple ways. And in this country, they're still used in floral arrangements. And if you have a bird seed feeder on the farm, make sure that you look and see what seed is there, because a thistle seed is still included in many bird seed mixes. So any way that it gets on the farm, we definitely need to take care of it because it competes with our forages. It takes up real estate. It's a big plant. It drains our soils of nutrients, of water, all those types of things that our good stuff needs. It is a cool season weed. So we like to say from about Thanksgiving all the way through Christmas, through January and really early February around Valentine's Day is about the last that we can spray for thistle and be really effective. The smaller a plant, the easier it is to kill. So the earlier, the better. A 2,4-D will take care of thistles. And so we just need to make sure that we're spraying early. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves trying to spray and seed heads have already been made and we're just not doing a lot of good. A China berry tree was introduced as an ornamental. It's native to the Himalayas and Asia. And so it came here as an ornamental tree, escaped the landscape, and is now found throughout the state. You'll notice on each tree or plant that we come to, up by the name, is a map of Arkansas and the counties that have reported that plant. Not that it's not where it's not reported, just nobody has reported it. So you see that here in southern Arkansas, we're pretty prevalent on China berry trees. Um, and it tends to colonize because of the vegetative reproduction. And it competes for real estate and nutrients, especially in our fields. It's not too picky about where it grows. The bad about China berry trees is that when they lose their leaves, they are alkaline leaves, and they raise the pH of our soils, thus getting rid of our native plants. And you see there on the bottom, 18 to 24 feet in 4 to 5 years. So it's a fast grower and is not a welcome guest at all. Field bindweed is our next. It was native to Europe and Asia. I never found an exact on how field bindweed got here, but I would imagine it's much like thistles. It was contaminated seed that came here. So it produces a very thick undergrowth, and it has fibrous roots and rhizomes that pull up sucker plants. And one of the other ways that field bindweed survives so well is its seed. It has a thick, hard outer coating on its seed. 80% of the seeds produced by field bindweed are impermeable to water. So it can stay viable for many, many years. It takes a while for nature to do that scarification process. And then when it does germinate, it can germinate in 10 to 15 days and then go and grow crazy. So that's one of the reasons why you think you've gotten it, you sprayed it, it was gone, and here it comes again. It's because of that seed that it has. The next one is Japanese honeysuckle. So honeysuckle is the most common invasive in the United States. It was native to East Asia and Japan and introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental. Then the USDA decided that they would promote it as a deer browse and erosion control. So it was spread pretty heavily through our country. But the fact that it's an evergreen and that it has few natural enemies allows it to grow as much as it wants. And so it gets thick, and while everything else is dormant, it's growing and it overtakes. And you know how thick it is, and it creates a shade, and it just gets rid of our natives that are underneath it. And of course, every time the honeysuckle touches the ground, it's going to produce roots, a whole new plant. And so it's hard to control because there are so many new plants formed that it has quite a network. Kudzu is a weed that the South is very well known to. It was native to China and Japan. It was introduced in the United States in 1876 as a garden display in Philadelphia. And it did well as a garden display. And so in the 30s, the USDA decided to push it as a soil erosion control effort. And then in the 40s, they encouraged it as a forage. But what we found is that cows don't really like kudzu, and they're not going to eat it as fast as it's going to grow, and that it will smother out with a blanket anything that was native. It can grow up to 60 feet per season, and the stems can be 1 to 4 inches in diameter. So that really makes it hard to control kudzu with a diameter that thick. Most of our sprays aren't going to do much to anything with that thick of a stem. Leafy spurge is our next. It was native to Europe and imported in the 1820s through contaminated seed. So we don't have a huge problem with leafy spurge. We find it in parking lots, in driveways, that type of thing around here. It's mainly a prairie or a field weed. So we can find it in our weeds. And the interesting thing about leafy spurge is that the roots produce a toxin and they kill undergrowth. So there is no competition when it decides to expand. It just keeps going and doing as much as it wants. But with all that green that it has, it really zaps our soils of nutrients and water. It doesn't have a deep root system, so all those nutrients that are on top is what it goes for. Privet is our next one. So we know privet takes over fence rows, anything that's not maintained. Privet is going to grow there. It has a fibrous root system. It has a taproot system, and then it has the berries that we see on the inset of the picture. So via birds or just root system vegetative growth, privet just kind of grows as it will whenever it wants to. It was native to Japan and Korea, introduced as an ornamental, a landscaping plant, and it escaped the landscaping and went to nature. So, it just makes it very hard to control. Cattle most of the time will not mess with privet, but goats love to browse on privet. So if you have a problem, it could make a control too. And we do have some herbicide recommendations also for privet control. Wisteria was native to Japan and Western Asia. It was introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental. And it escaped the landscape. And its problem is that it overtakes native shrubs and trees and literally strangles trees. As a student at SAU, one of my favorite things about magnolia was the spring and when the wisteria came out, and it's everywhere. But you can find it in some pretty sizable pine trees. So that's one of our problems, is that it can really take over large trees and kill them out. And then as it falls down, the wisteria goes with it, and then it just allows it to spread even more, and most of the time choking out all the native plants. Chinese tallow tree, when I was about 10, my grandmother decided to plant one in my mama's yard, and it has gone crazy in the last however many years. I won't tell my age, but Chinese tallow trees were native to China and Japan and Taiwan. They were introduced to the United States in the 1700s in South Carolina. And then in the 1900s, the USDA, in an effort to create a soap making industry, distributed Chinese tallow trees all through the Gulf Coast. And that became a problem fairly quickly. They colonized through their shallow root system. And then they also produce those berries that you see on the picture. And birds and other animals eat those seeds and spread it. They don't like a lot of traffic, so they love waterways and ditches, places where there's not a lot of traffic or animals tromping. But the problem that can be with tallow tree is that the leaves do produce toxins. And when they fall, other animals will come through and eat those and cause a problem, and it does make a nice ornamental tree, but it escapes and it produces other trees so quickly. Does have a nice fall color to it, but it does take over quickly. Tree of Heaven was native to China, introduced in 1784, again in Philadelphia at a garden show. And it became pretty popular in the 1840s in nurseries. And then when we saw the Chinese come to California during the gold rush, they brought Tree of Heaven. So this is a dioecious tree, which means that it has a female tree and a male tree, such as ginkgo biloba is also the same way. What we see with this is that it is a prolific cedar, and it doesn't have to have a male and a female, but they also can colonize from roots, and they grow incredibly fast. So Tree of Heaven is on our invasive list here in Arkansas. We don't have a long list, but Tree of Heaven is quickly becoming a big nuisance in this state. A mimosa tree can also be known as a silk tree. It was native from Iran all the way to Japan, and it was introduced in 1745 as an ornamental. It's still very popular. It does have those showy flowers and a nice fragrance to it. I remember as a kid pretending that the seed pods were bananas. But, it is a popular tree that we see around, but mainly because it's now an invasive. And they grow very quickly. and they don't care where they reside. They grow in a lot of different soils. And part of the problem is because of its palmate leaf, it does create a lot of shade and shades out the undergrowth and kills the ecosystem that once was there. Trifoliate orange is our next one. So obviously the spines become a bit of a problem, but the fruit can too. It invades our woodlands, forest edges, fence rows, and urban green spaces. And those long thorns can become harmful to livestock and tractor tires all the same. So it is a problem for us. And again, it's a non-native, so there's not many enemies, and it grows as it will. All right. And our last invasive is spiny pigweed, which has become a huge problem for us here in southwest Arkansas. This map shows what I was talking about, that the map shows what has been reported. But there's a lot of places that haven't been reported. Right now on this, Pike County is not green, but it will be soon because I signed up to be a reporter. And the problem we see with spiny pigweed is that it's a prolific seeder. And it's really hard to control. This isn't one of those things that you're going to spray out and get rid of it and not see it again. The recommendations of Grazon and Weedmaster and 2,4-D do an excellent job, but the amount of seeds that are found on a pigweed plant means that repeat applications must be made. You will kill that adult plant, but you won't do anything to the seed. And it won't take long for that seed to get out and become a problem. So anyone with an issue with pigweed here, and especially in southwest Arkansas and spiny pigweed, we know that it grows quickly, it grows everywhere, and it seeds out really quick. So repeat applications are needed, and it's really important to keep on because it can become a problem in no time. Take up all that real estate. You can have a field that's just solid with pigweed. Last year, when the armyworms were so bad, we even saw that armyworms, though, ate on pigweed. So, it is a problem, and it can take over areas really quickly. And as far as, it's one of those weeds that you also know the importance of scientific names, because not many people know it by spiny pigweed. But lots of people, especially here in Pike County, call it careless weed, and they talk about careless weed. But it is a problem. But it's not hard to control, just repeat applications are necessary. So just wanted to kind of go over some of the resources that I used to make this presentation. So Dr. Boyd, who is an employee with UAEX, has a PowerPoint called Poisonous Plants to Livestock in the Southern U.S., and can be found on our uaex.edu website. And that's where I got a lot of good information, and there's a lot of good pictures in that presentation. Also, fact sheet 3025, Common Arkansas Poisonous Plants to Cattle, written by Dr. Jennings, is also an excellent resource to go to. And there are plants that are on that fact sheet that I did not put in this PowerPoint, just because I try to put the more common plants that we saw. TextiveInvasives.org has a wonderful database on invasives. And here in Arkansas, we have arinvasives.org, which tells a lot about the invasives that we find here. And the edmaps.org gives a map to where they have been reported. But you can kind of, even if it's not 100% accurate, you can kind of see the migration of weeds and where they started and where they're coming from. So if you have any questions, there is a chat box that we can use. Of course, you can always call our office at 285-2161 or send an email. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I can also email that so that you have it as a resource.